Hello everybody and welcome to this video, which perhaps we can say it has been long overdue. You see, when I published my Chessable course on the King's Indians, it was received really well, and very soon afterwards I started receiving requests for a complementary course on the anti-King's Indians. Now obviously that would have been the logical next step, but I remember back in the day I was talking about this to Chessable, but somehow, well, the decision was taken that, okay, probably, other courses should have preference, and as it happened, I never really made this course. Now, in order not to let my students without any ideas what to do, what I did at the time was I wrote a post on the Chessable forum, on the forum of the course, King's Indian Simplified, and there I shared my ideas about possible lines against the anti-King's Indians. Most frequent ones like the London system, the Torre, the Jobava, and so forth. So this was very useful for the students at the time, but obviously, well, people want more, people would like to know more details, and that's how I finally got the time in this new 2025 to record this video, where I would like to give you a kind of a more in-depth view of some of the ideas that I consider pretty good ones against all these setups that one can try against the King's Indian defense. So let's see what I have in mind. So d4, knight f6, and now we will look at the most common anti-King's Indians, like I said, the London system, the Jobava, the Torre attack, but also the Barry attack, which can also arise via the Jobava system. So we will look at the London system via the move order knight f3 and then bishop f4, because the immediate bishop f4 shouldn't really make a difference, especially if black sticks to the fianchetto lines with g6. And generally in this video I will stick to these g6 plans, even though I will mention some others as well, because they are, let's say, most like King's Indian in their spirit, I would say. And I expect that people who play the King's Indian are used to fianchettoing their bishop to g7, and I looked at these lines with a fianchetto, even though other lines are perfectly fine. So, for example, via this move order, if you like to stir things up a little bit, you can try the move c5 and intending something like queen b6, yeah, and immediately targeting this pawn on b2. And a game that actually drew my attention to this line was the game Trompowsky, played in Baku 2010. After d5, Kramnik played a very nice move b5, introducing these Benko style ideas. But more importantly, with bishop b7, he is actually going after the pawn on d5. You can check the game, very interesting game, won by black. So it's an interesting way, to black to try to take advantage of the second move, bishop f4. Obviously, white can try e3 or c3 when black has additional ideas based on this early queen sortie with queen b6. You can check these on your own if you're interested. In this video, like I said, I'll concentrate on the lines with the g6. So we will take a look at this via the second move, knight f3 move order. On the second move, of course, we have the Trompowsky with bishop g5. It was much more popular many years ago. Nowadays, okay, there are quite a few ways for black to deal with the trump. And here, for example, in this video, I chose the move knight e4 as the most, I would say, King's Indian in spirit. Of course, there are many moves, like d5 is very popular, and pretty much everybody's playing that. There is also e6, yeah. And for example, after e6, if now knight f3, you can check my video on the Torre and London systems when I analyzed Karpov's plan. You can find it on the channel. There is also c5 that has been played by Fischer, for example. That's also very interesting. But I think knight e4 is the kind of, let's say, most direct, hitting the bishop. And in most of the lines, it would lead to some, let's say, Benoni type of positions, which I think are the closest in spirit to the King's Indian. Now everybody goes bishop f4. The alternatives are, well, possible, but not that great. For example, bishop h4 is the worst. After g5, black will immediately gain the bishop pair. If knight g3, if after bishop g3, knight g3 will be possible, and the bishop will be quite good on the long diagonal. Whereas a move like h4 is possible again, but not so commonly played. I think here again many ways are possible, but I kind of like d5, knight d2, and now again many moves possible like bishop f5, or c5, or even f6. But the most direct, it seemed to me, to take on g5, hg5, and e5 playing in the center. So black has the pair of bishops and just plays in the center, just natural common play. And now there is a kind of a line that's not really necessary to know, but I'll show it anyway. D takes e5, queen g5, attacking the pawn on e5, knight f3, queen e7, and now the idea is to go knight d7 and attack that pawn on e5. So white must be very quick. Yeah, so e4 is the best move. Knight d7, take on d5, take on e5, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, knight d7, discovered check. Yeah, king f1 and long castle. And this is pretty sharp, okay, but black is perfectly fine, obviously. Kings are on opposite sides, so things can become sharp, but also they can also simplify. But it's still an interesting line and an unorthodox line, yeah, and a position that you get. Now bishop f4 is the main move, and now c5. c5, again, introducing these Benoni type of ideas, especially in the positions when white pushes d5. Now there are two options, d5 and f3. After d5, queen b6. We already mentioned this idea earlier. Yeah, a common idea in all these positions when white leaves the b2 pawn without protection by developing the dark squared bishop early on. And now white can try to either sacrifice that pawn on b2 or play bishop c1 and defend it. And it appears that the pawn sacrifice is the more dangerous try with knight d2. But here there is one thing that black should remember. After queen takes b2, winning the pawn, knight e4. It's not a blundering of a piece because of queen b4 check, and black will regain the piece. And now in both cases, either after c3 or queen d2, the key move to remember is the following. So let's say c3, queen e4, e3, and now the key move e5. The same move is possible with a queen on d2 instead of a pawn on c3. And the point being that d6, queen e6, it's quite comfortable and pretty equal for black. And this just solves all the problems. I mean, black has additional ideas like g5 here, for example, but no need to complicate matters, especially this is probably not a line that you'll get to see too often. So the key idea, like I said, in this position is to go e5 and force d takes e6, queen e6 with free development. Whereas after bishop c1, yeah, an interesting idea is the move c4. Now you're hoping that you win in an instant by delivering mate on f2, but if white sees that, goes e3, now e6. And d6, d6, and this is already very nice for black. White wasted time with the bishop going outside and then back to c1, whereas black already has some leading development. Bear in mind that bishop c4, queen b4 check, and wins the bishop on c4, so that's not possible. And after knight f3, queen c7, defending the pawn on c4, white, well, black is obviously very comfortable. Bishop e7, short castle, yeah, then maybe b6, bishop b7, knight d7, or b5, depending on circumstances. Comfortable play for black. So this is quite a kind of simple way to deal with the bishop c1. f3 is the main move, in fact. Yeah, and after queen a5 check, c3, knight f6. Now the engine suggests pushing d5, and it actually quite likes white's position, But as I will show you, it's a very sharp position, and I think one that the King's Indian players would not mind playing at all. The other main line is knight d2, and after cd4, knight b3, attacking the queen. Yeah, and now the queen can go to different spots, to d8, to b6, to f5. All are possible. But what I personally have liked most for black is the move queen d8, and after cd4, the move e6. And what I like here is the flexibility of black's position. So e4, and now this check on b4. And what I like is that black has this option of going for d5 and introducing some French, inducing a French structure after e5, knight d7. But also there is the option to go d6, and then just play with the small center e6, d6, and then, depending on circumstances, going d5, going e5, or just keeping the pawns where they are. So to show you, let's say bishop d2, take on d2, queen d2, castles, knight d2, and d6. And this is quite comfortable. Yeah, I mean, no dark squared bishop, so there is an extra square on e7 for a piece. For example, the queen can go there. Knight c6, bishop d7, the queen can come to b6, a5, a4, harassing the knight on b3. There are different ideas for black, and quite comfortable in the three ranks that black has at his disposition. So, meaning that the space advantage that white has doesn't really matter much. Against the more, let's say, ambitious king f2, like I explained, black has a choice, going for French structures, let's say d5, e5, knight fd7, and then going castles, f6, starting play on the f file in the center, in French kind of manner. Note that white still has to finish the development of the king side. The king on f2 is not ideal, so it's quite okay. But there is also bishop e7, rook c1, and d6. Now black has an extra piece here, but white has a king on f2, which kind of gets in the way. So still needs a lot of time to finish development, get the rook out, maybe castle artificially, and black still is fine. Let's say knight c6, maybe e5 at some point will happen, attacking the bishop. So it's an unclear position, quite playable for black. So the engine, like I said, suggests d5, and now plays rather forced e6, undermining that pawn, e4, ed5, ed5, d6, and we have this kind of a Schmidt-Benoni kind of position where we have the symmetrical structure. Yeah, but Benoni positions, even in these symmetrical structures, should be kind of closer to spirit to King's Indian players, and here also it is the case. Knight a3, going to, not that long, going to c4, bishop e7. This is faster than fianchettoing the bishop, because black needs to be faster with the development. So knight c4, queen c7, a4, stopping b5, yeah, castles. And here, why, I mean, the engine seems to prefer white somewhat in this position, but after a while, it kind of drops down to some, let's say, minimal advantage for white. And what I think that this is quite acceptable for black is that white is a bit awkwardly developed. Okay, this pawn on f3 especially, as the knight cannot come to f3, and king is also vulnerable on the e file. So let's say knight e2, rook e8, king f2. This is what white should do, get out of the e file, knight bd7, and now the idea that is very important one for black is the move b5, sacrificing a pawn, and then bishop b7 going after the pawn on d5. This is even more markedly shown against the engine's move g4. This is what the engine suggests for white. Rook e8, obviously developing the rook on the e file, king f2, knight d7, h4, and bishop f8. So you can see black is quite compact. If g5, knight h5. Sorry. And otherwise, don't forget about this idea of b5. So just to illustrate, knight e2, b5, a b5, bishop b7, and the pawn on d5 is attacked. Knight e3, defending the pawn. Knight b6, attacking the pawn again. Yeah, 3 times. c4, and it seems that, okay, what the hell was black's idea here? It seems everything is protected, but now comes the powerful idea, rook e3. bishop e3 and knight c4. And this is great compensation for black. Yeah, the pawn on d5 is attacked. There is the threat to gain the pair of bishops and eliminating the important dark squared bishops. The bishop for white, I don't need to explain to King's Indian players what that means. Dark square compensation is always a big factor in King's Indian positions. And let's not forget that the white king doesn't really have a safe shelter. It's quite an interesting dynamic line for black against the Trompowsky. So that's the tromp. Yeah. Now let's go back to the very popular Jobava knight c3 system. Now, unless you play the Pirts, and I'm not sure how many King's Indian players play the Pirts, you can go g6, e4, d6 and just allow it. But I would assume that you don't play it, so d5 is the only way to stop e4. And now bishop f4. And here, for example, black is not forced to go for g6, and in fact, in my lifetime repertoire of the Chembarenko, I proposed the system with c6 and then bishop f5, more like Slav-like development. In my lifetime repertoire on the Queen's Gambit declined, I proposed the system with c5, also quite a good system, very solid system. And there are other systems as well. You can go bishop f5, you can go a6, stopping knight b5, and then e6 and c5, b5, like Carlsen has played. So all these are pretty good systems. But still, to kind of keep it, I don't know, King's Indian stylish, yeah, I will look at the lines with g6. So g6, and now what is important for black to know is that the straightforward play by white, like queen d2, bishop g7, bishop h6, would actually backfire for white because he just lags back in development. Castles, take on g7, king g7, castles long, and now c5. And as you will see, this is quite dangerous for white. For example, an attempt to keep the center with e3 is bad because c4 already gives black an advantage. b5, b4 is coming even with the sacrifice of a pawn. So let's say e4, now undermining the center, b5. And it's clear that black's attack is coming faster. For example, e5, queen a5, defending the pawn, threatening b4. Then a2 would hang, d5 would hang. It's just bad for white already. And in case of e5, knight e8, knight b5, knight c6, the center is closed, and the sacrificed pawn actually just opened the file for black. Already serious advantage for black here. So that's a serious mistake, e3 after c5. White should play dc5, but after queen a5, again it's clear that it is black who has the initiative. Knight d5, queen a2, threatening mate, queen c3, rook d8, yeah, again threatening check and rook d5 check. So e4, defending the knight, and bishop e6. So white has an extra pawn, but black has a lead in development, and white's king is not that safe. Yeah, and obviously this is a good position for black. Knight can come to c6, just continuing development, and there is also a check. And then whenever the king comes to d2, the queen can draw back to a4, attack the pawn on e4. It's a pleasure to play this position with black. So that's why it's important to remember that after g6, this direct play queen d2, bishop a6 actually is good for black. Now knight b5 is possible, but after knight a6, defending the pawn, and c6, the knight will have to go back. So e3 is usually played, bishop g7. And now there is a choice. For example, the move knight f3 is a possible, and that is also a line that can arise from the Barry attack, which is knight f3, d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, knight c3, d5, bishop f4, bishop g7, e3. There is the move knight b5, which I mentioned, and there is also the move h4. So I'll briefly go over all of these. Knight f3, the Barry attack. And now, against the Barry, it's like, I would like to propose a line that is kind of a, I think, psychologically and practically a trap for white. Because if white continues in the usual ways of the Barry attack, he can actually land up in some sort of positional trouble. Whereas if white plays in the best way possible, then we get to some kind of a messy position. So the normal way here to continue is just go castle, bishop e2, c5, and black is fine. Yeah. But what I would like to propose is the move bishop g4. And now, first I'll show you the so-called trap. Yeah. So let's say white goes bishop e2, breaking the pin, normal move, c6. And this line that I've also played myself with black is based on some games by Garry Kasparov in the 80s and 90s. And one of them followed here with short castle. It was played against Vlastimil Hort in their match in 1988. And it just shows how black gains the upper hand with simple means. Castles, h3, take on f3, take on f3, knight b7, and what black does was simply go rook e8, rook e8 and e5 and get the better position. Then Kasparov won the game. So very simple, very straightforward play. Nothing really to invent here. Just push e5 in the center and be better. But the idea of the bear is to go knight e5. Yeah? Knight e5, centralizing the knight. Okay, bishop takes e2, queen e2, and now comes the idea, Kasparov's idea, knight h5. Going after the bishop on f4, h4, Barry wants to attack, take on f4, e4, and now important move h5 to stop white from pushing h5. Long castle, knight d7. Yeah. And what's funny here is that the engine somewhat prefers white, but in practice this is just fantastic for black. King b1, e6, and you can see that the structure is really untouchable. And what black will do, g3 for example, he will exchange his bishop, which was not very active anyway, bishop e5, fe5, and then go queen a5 and start an attack. And this was played in the game Miguel Kasparov, which was a simul in 1993, which Kasparov won. But this is obviously the positional trap that I explained, is that white plays naturally, castles long, hopes for an attack, but in fact it will be black who gets to attack. b5, b4, knight b6, knight c4, rook b8. Yeah, and if it's necessary, the king can castle short, it can stay in the center, but ultimately even it's possible to castle long, get the king to a8, and then continue with the attack with the king on a8 safe. So a very, very pleasant position for black and to play with for an attack. So this is the trap, yeah, after bishop g4. But if white knows what he's doing, he would go h3 immediately, force the exchange, yeah, bishop f3, queen f3, c6, yeah, and now if white does nothing, black will go, let's say, castles, knight d7, rook e8, and e5, yeah, so white should go g4, knight bd7, h4, threatening some h5. So black should go h5 and stop the advance. g5, knight g4, bishop h3. Now it appears that, okay, that knight is a bit stranded, but e5 just comes just in time. And this is the messy position I was talking about. Now, white should go bishop g3 and now short castle. It's kind of pretty messy, but again, I think it's very a good character of the position for the king's Indian play. Now, for example, taking the pawn, bishop g4, h4, queen g4, after e4, check on e8, underlines the vulnerability of the king, king f1, queen b6, and black definitely has compensation here. There is a double attack on the pawn on d4, pawn on b2. Again, sharp position, but good chances for black here. In fact, instead of taking the pawn, the engine proposes long castle, but here f5 comes. Yeah, so strengthening the knight on g4, and if gf6, knight df6, and threatening some knight e4, hitting the queen, attacking f2. Kind of a very sharp position, but one where black isn't really worse. It's a kind of a sharp position for in the middle game. So this is the trappy, like I said, line against the Barry attack, but also mind you that this can also rise via the Jobava, so you can use it against both. Now knight b5 is sometimes played, okay, attacking the pawn on c7, forcing knight a6. And here an interesting idea that I liked is the following one, h3 for example, to get the bishop to safety just in case, and now knight e4. And the idea of the move is that this knight on b5 after c6 will have to go back to c3 when after knight takes c3, bc3, black will succeed in doubling the white pawns on the c file. Yeah. So if white wants to avoid this, he should go bishop d3, 6 and bishop e4. But again, this is fine for black. d e4, knight c3, queen b6. Yeah. The common idea, attacking the pawn on b2, rook b1 and c5. And now attacking white center. And the engine also even gives some advantage to white here. So this is a very interesting idea that I liked. So h3 is not that great. White should go knight f3. But the same idea here is possible, knight e4. The difference being that white can challenge the knight with knight d2. But now simply take on d2, go c6, knight drops back to c3, knight c7. And it's clear that black doesn't really have problems here. One pair of knights exchanged, all the other pieces are well developed or can be well developed, and black is fine. If you want some sharper play, you don't go knight e4, you can go c6, knight c3, queen b6. Let's say, attacking the pawn on b2, rook b1, knight h5, going after the bishop. Yeah, and then play on the whole board. Yeah, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, knight c7. Yeah. And then you go g5, win the bishop pair after bishop g3, knight g3, h3, go c5, start attacking white center with pretty good play for black. Yeah, so it's well, knight b5 is not really, critical. And the last move to check here, we check knight f3, knight b5, and then move h4. Yeah, h5. Yeah, it's good to stop any ideas based on h5, but also with h5, what black does is to establish this very strong control over the g4 square, so no attacks actually can happen. So knight f3, castles. Yeah, here knight g4, bishop g4, similar to the Barry, is possible, but after queen d2 takes on f3, gf3, it's kind of sharp. Possible, by all means, but kind of a bit uncommon. The most popular line is just castling, queen d2, and playing in the center with c5. The point of the idea of c5 is that the pawn is taboo, dc5, knight bd7. Black wants to recapture, and taking on d5 even loses. Knight d5, knight d5, queen d5, bishop b2, attacking the rook, but also threatening check on c3. Rook b1, check on c3, knight d2, knight c5, and everything collapses, yeah? The knight on d2. After exchange of queens, even knight e4 will be possible, so it's just game over. So this is horrible for white, losing. Therefore, the white normally plays knight e5, knight c6, and now f3 to control the e4 square. And now there are many moves for black. One is queen a5. Other one is the very interesting knight d7, putting in more pressure on e5, but leaving d5 unattended for a while, or take on d4, e4, and bishop f5 with sharp play. Yeah, rook is coming to c8. This has been played in quite a few of high-level games. Black normally scores well, and even you can see the position is quite sound and quite. It's possible to play like this for black. So that's the Jobava based on g6. Now we turn our attention to the second move, knight f3, g6. Knight c3 Jobava, knight c3 d5, bishop f4 is the Jobava system, the Barry attack, but we looked at it via the Jobava. And here what we need to look at is the Torre attack with bishop g5, the London system obviously with bishop f4, and the lines with g3, which are quite annoying, I think. They used to be annoying to me when I was playing the King's Indian, and also they are some sort of anti-King's Indians, especially, as white does not play c4. Now, let's start with the Torre attack, bishop g5, bishop g7, and now white can play e3, c3, but I will start with the move knight bd2, because I think from black's perspective is the most annoying one, because against the other moves, let's say e3, c3, black can play the plans with c5, which I have personally liked, and especially let's say something like e3, c5, let's say, I don't know, knight d2, and now take on d4, e4, and these structures, this asymmetrical structure, offer quite a bit of interesting prospects to black, as his idea is to go d6, knight c6, obviously castle, and then push e5 in the center. Yeah, and then after d5 to have these 4 pawns against 3, and quite active play piece play in the center. However, knight d2 actually, it's the most direct move because it also threatens e4. Now again, if you play the peers, you don't mind this, you go castles, you allow e4, you play d6, you play the peers. But if you don't play the peers, then it's a bit tricky. And the problem with c5 here, and the reason why I haven't particularly liked this in this version, is the somewhat unexpected bishop takes f6. And after bishop f6, knight e4. So you see it's a double attack on the bishop and the pawn on c5. Now the engine suggests queen b6, but after knight f6, ef6, b3, it's so dull and like there is no dynamic potential in the position. There was an old game by Kasparov with bishop d4, knight d4, c d4, queen d4, castle, which obviously is equal, but it's quite comfortable for white. Like some pieces have been exchanged, white has no problems, black doesn't have problems, but it's hard to stir up any activity in this position. So with this in mind, against the Torre, I would propose a straightforward system, very similar to what I mentioned previously when I mentioned the game Hort-Kasparov, and it starts with a move d5, stopping e4. And now black's plan is actually to go castle and then go for the e5 push. So just to show you, e3, castles, c3, knight b7, and the plan is to go rook e8 and e5. Very simple plan, very straightforward plan, just giving black a very good position. Nothing to kind of to complicate it, and just simple, straightforward play in the center. Yeah? So bishop e2 or bishop d3 doesn't really matter. Rook e8, castles, and e5, and that's it. Basically, move 8. That's all you need to know. You get a good position. You play in the center, some space advantage in the center. No problems whatsoever. Let's say d5, knight e5, knight e5, rook e5, attacking the bishop. Yeah, bishop e4, rook drops back. And then either c6 or c5, depending on how you want to play it. Bishop f5, maybe knight e4. Simple play in the center, space advantage thanks to the pawn on d5. Very good bishop, especially if white tries to undermine the center with c4. No problems for black. The engine actually proposes to keep the tension and go a4. And now black has a choice. You can attack the center with c5. Yeah, but you can also go for some space gaining play with e4, knight e1, c6, a5, let's say knight f8, and then you go h5, knight h7, hitting that bishop. Yeah, and then the bishop can be transferred via f8 to d6, and you probably know these King's Indian attack ideas for black. King's Indian players should know these ideas, and I mean you understand that this is actually quite okay for black. So this is a really simple, straightforward solution for the Torre attack. So now let's move on to the g3 systems. g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castles, and d6. And there are quite some moves here for white. c4 would be the King's Indian, for which I believe you would be prepared. But there are some other moves which can be a bit more or less annoying. I remember that back in the day I was annoyed with this move a4. But I also then liked this idea of knight a6, preparing c5. So my idea was to go c5. And after dc5, knight c5, there would be some Sicilian type of looking position. Yeah, Sicilian structure. Otherwise, if d5, that would be some sort of a Benoni-ish like, which I wouldn't mind, and I would think King's Indian players wouldn't mind. So kind of this is a nice idea to try against a4. Another idea is the move knight c3. And here, just before continuing, I remember some sort of a rule of thumb back in the day that somebody told me, or I read it somewhere, I don't know, is that in this type of position, if you want to create some sort of imbalance, then as black, you should develop the queen's knight asymmetrically to the development of white's queen's knight. In other words, if white develops the knight on c3, you don't develop the knight to c6, you develop it to d7. And if white develops the knight to d2, you don't go symmetrically to d7, but rather to c6. So this is the way how to create some sort of imbalance in these positions. So after knight c3, knight bd7, there is this very famous game, Holmov-Fischer, which also featured in the My 60 Memorable Games. I would recommend you take a look at it. I'll just show you how it went. Holmov went b3, if e4, e5. Yeah, it's typical King's Indian play, and then black goes c6, queen c7, then maybe b6, bishop b7. Further on, maybe even expand with b5 and so forth. Typical kind of King's Indian type of play, with the difference that the pawn is still on c2. You may even call it this like kind of a Pirtz kind of type of position, but with a fianchetto for white. So Holmov played b3, e5, take on e5, take on e5, e4, rook e8. And it's funny that here already the engine gives some slight advantage even to black, which you wouldn't really expect, but yeah. So Holmov went bishop a3, c6, bishop d6, queen a5. And it's funny that here Holmov thought he was already lost. And Fischer was also a similar opinion, but in fact, white has two moves that keep the balance just barely. One is the surprising a3, threatening to go back with the bishop, and after bishop, queen c3, bishop b4, queen b2, rook b1, queen a2. The queen cannot be trapped, but it also cannot escape, so we have a repetition and a draw. And the other move is the move b4, b4, queen b6, which leads to some unclear play. Holmov's next move was the losing mistake, in fact, queen d3, defending the knight on c3, but after the perhaps surprising rook e6, threatening to take on d6 and take on c3, black is already winning. 12 moves, black is winning. And Fischer, of course, went on to win this game, played in Skopje, in my city, in 1967. So that's the move, knight c3, knight bd7, yeah. And perhaps the most popular option here for white is the move b3, the double fianchetto. And here, I mean, you can even play e5, you can also play knight bd7 or knight c6 and all these moves. But I think I quite like what Carlsen did some years back. He played the move b5. Yeah. A bit surprising, but it does stop c4. In case of c4, then bc, the b file will be open. So the game was against Georg Meyer, 2019, that Carlsen won. It went bishop b2, bishop b7, some sort of a double fianchetto for both sides, but with a bit off, you could say b5 that controls the c4 square. So knight bd2, knight bd7, c4, bc4. And now in the game, Meyer went knight c4, and after a5, rook c1, c5, dc5, knight c5. This was excellent for black, who had like again some sort of a Sicilian structure with kind of a very good control of the queen side, where white cannot advance with his own majority. And Carlsen won this game later on. And in case of bc4, rook b8, queen c2, all pieces are on the board, and black has different ideas. One is knight e4, for example. The point being that if white takes twice on e4, let's say, that means that he will also lose this bishop on b2, which is, again, leads to an equal position. But there is also the sharper e5, d5, d5, again with a kind of an unclear position. The tactical point is that the pawn on e5 cannot be taken, as knight e5 after bishop g2, king g2, rook b2, queen b2, and knight g4. Black wins material because the knight is pinned and cannot really be defended, as f4 is even worse. Knight e5, d5, f e5, bishop e5, and there is the attack on the queen, the rook, there is knight e3, everything just falls apart. So black wins. So these are the interesting options after queen c2. So this double fianchetto, I think b5 is an interesting idea to kind of stir things up a little bit. And for the end, we left the infamous London system. Now, after bishop f4, bishop g7, and let's say e3, I would also refer you to an old video of mine that you will find on this channel, which the name is something like how to diffuse the London system in 10 minutes. And indeed, it's like the video is a bit less than 10 minutes. And there I explained this very, very good plan against the London system based on the development with b6, bishop b7, d6, c5, knight bd7, obviously with castle, and then the plan of a6, b5, and simple, straightforward play on the queen side. I really would suggest you take a look at this video because it's a very, very good plan against the London, and to my mind, even perhaps definitely one of the best plans against the London system with the double fianchetto for black. I won't repeat myself. Check that video for this plan. But here I would like to show you another plan, which I think is more, in a way, with a bit of a different idea. And that idea is, let's say, the more King's Indian kind of idea, going for e5 in the center. So d6, let's say, h3, allowing for bishop h2, castles, bishop e2, and now queen e8. So this is the idea that I had in mind. Like I said, the plan with the double fianchetto with b6, bishop b7, check that video, how to defuse the London system in 10 minutes on the channel. But queen e8 is actually interesting because black is playing for the e5 push. So short castle and knight c6. And now e5 comes. The tactical justification is that d5 is met by e5. And obviously black would not mind opening the long diagonal for his bishop and gaining the bishop pair by taking the white's dark squared bishop. And of course, if white moves with the bishop wherever, the bishop will be awful, and black will have this typical King's Indian structure with a looming attack on the king side after f5. So bishop h2 and now e5. And this is black's plan to push e5 and then later on to go queen e7. Yeah, the knight can come to e4 or to d7 and then f5, e4, and possibly continuing with an attack with g5 and hoping for f4 and so on. So it's a more kind of a different type of play with more orientation towards white's king side. So that's another idea against the London system. I have quite a few on my channel, I think, by now. Hope you enjoy those. So now it's time to wrap up this video of anti-King's Indians. I hope you like them, especially those who have studied my Chessable course, King's Indian Simplified, but also pretty much everybody else who plays the King's Indian, or simply you want to have an idea what to do against these different systems that white can play when avoiding the King's Indian defense. So guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe both to my channel, both to my Substack, and if you like my work, also consider becoming a paid subscriber on my Substack. I would really appreciate that. So I will finish off with my Hikaru. Smash that subscribe button. Hope you like that. And thanks for watching again. I'll see you soon. Cheers.